Hey guys, it's Laura back with episode 5 of the Depolarizers podcast, where we talk to those who are effectively working to depolarize our politics. In today's episode, we have Robb Willer of the Stanford Polarization and Social Change Lab. Robb's going to tell us about how rhetoric, identity, and values can do a lot to depolarize our politics. Thanks for joining, and let's get into it. Robb Willer is a professor in the departments of sociology, psychology, and the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. He is the director of the Polarization and Social Change Lab and the co-director of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Robb's teaching and research focus on social forces that bring people together, like morality and altruism, forces that divide them, like fear and prejudice, and domains of social life that feature the complex interplay of the two, like hierarchies and politics. Welcome, Robb.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm happy to be here with you, Laura.
Amazing. So let's just get on to it. I feel like we need to hear about this lab of yours, and I also feel like we need to take a field trip. So do you mind talking to us about your lab?
Yeah, absolutely. So here at Stanford, I direct the Polarization and Social Change Lab, and we study a bunch of different things having to do with American politics, a lot of political psychology, a lot of work on what are effective ways to intervene on difficult political dilemmas in the contemporary U.S. that stand in the way of affecting social change.
That's amazing. And do you mind walking us through some of the perhaps examples of how you guys evaluate the current political parties and perhaps some of their contributions or even detractions from polarization? For example, are there partisan activities or are there just human activities that people engage in on either side of the aisle that contribute to greater polarization or less polarization?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we study polarization from a lot of different angles. We tend to focus on the role of everyday people in polarization, but we're also interested in elites as well. The way I think about polarization is in terms of sort of two key distinctions. So the distinction between elites, so politicians, influential people in the media, party leaders, donors, at high level donors, so elites, and then everyday folks like us, like, voters, just everyday people. And then the other big distinction that I think about is the distinction between affective or emotional polarization, dislike of people you disagree with, especially people on the other side of the political divide, and then attitudinal polarization or ideological polarization. So disagreement on issues, policies, candidates, and so on. And if you take these two big distinctions, you sort of create four kinds of, do you see me trying to make, here I'm trying to make like a figure here, I don't know, a table. So you can imagine having four different kinds of polarization. And we study all of those forms of polarization because they're all really interesting. But we've maybe studied what's called affective polarization in the American mass public the most. So people's dislike of rival partisans and people they disagree with, maybe even on their own side, which I also think is kind of an underrated and important, interesting thing. And one thing that's kind of interesting about trends in polarization, like everybody has this sense polarization is getting worse in America, but they kind of mush these four kinds of polarization together when they talk about it. So they sort of mush the attitudinal and the affective polarization together, it seems like people disagree more. It seems like people dislike each other more. Definitely are related things, but they're also important, I think, scientifically to distinguish. And then they also mush together what they're seeing on MSNBC and Fox News and what they're hearing in their neighborhood or the difficult conversation they were in their workplace or at Thanksgiving dinner or what have you. But it is really important if you're going to track trends and causes and consequences to also take these things apart. And one thing I think is really interesting is all of those kinds of polarization, all those kinds of polarization are increasing over time. But interestingly, the one that's increasing the least is, or least clearly, is attitudinal polarization in the mass public. So the extent to which everyday Americans disagree on the issues and policies. There is good evidence that there is increased disagreement amongst the politically engaged. So folks like us, folks who would be watching this or listening to this, would be, probably in the group of Americans that are increasing in the extent to which they disagree over time. But there's a bunch of Americans who, frankly, have better stuff to do with their time, are not super dialed in on politics, and their degree of disagreement has not been increasing that much over time. Their attitudes are not that organized around coherent ideologies, and they're somewhat innocent of ideology and polarization, you might say, because they're just occupying their time with other things. Just they may even be exhibiting some increased affective polarization where they dislike people that they perceive as having different political stripes from them, but they don't necessarily line up with those like, attitudes that are prescribed by party platforms, leaders, politicians, and so on.
That's interesting. So, would you perhaps say that some of the education polarization we've seen as it has increased over the past probably decade, particularly, would you say that has contributed to the polarization rise in our country, where there's more people who are going to college and getting PhDs and doing things, and they find themselves in increasingly polarizing attitudes versus people who have not pursued multiple degrees and things like that. Maybe, like you said, not having the attitudinal polarization elements of them.
Yeah, I mean that's that's super interesting to bring the education polarization trends in the U.S. into this, which are of course echoed globally. And I actually haven't seen research that's really broke that down of like what do you get when you take the less ideological, less sort of ideologically consistent, coherent views of less educated folks, just because they haven't been socialized into a certain way to think about things. That is the one that you would get from consuming lots and lots of political content in the US. What do you get when you put that together with the education polarization trends? Like, what does that mean about there should be some asymmetry there. And I guess one thing that I would take away from that is that some education polarization should be reversible. So if it's the case that the people sort of higher in education that are on one end of the education polarization trend that are getting increasingly liberal and increasingly supportive of the Democratic Party, college educated Americans, those folks are getting initiated and socialized into a pretty coherent set of views that might stick, because they all kind of line up. They're part of a coherent worldview. Meanwhile, lower education folks are increasingly conservative, increasingly supporting the Republican Party, but also lower education folks tend to not have the time to engage politically in the same way higher education folks do, and they just engage differently. And so they tend to not just draw in all of that, all those, the party platforms and so on, which may actually offer some insight on why the contemporary Republican Party finds party platforms so sort of malleable and inessential. That's not really the motivation for a large part of their base. But I
Yeah.
think that also means there's malleability there of like, if you bring the right policies that deliver for the interests of low education folks, then I'm assuming that the Democrats could grab more of those folks because of that underlying malleability.
I love it. So I think this is kind of in the same vein, but taking a step back, I wanted to ask you about you've written about a fictitious candidate, Scott Miller, and about how he he can talk about different policy issues, but it's not necessarily what he's talking about and
Mm-hmm.
the actual policies themselves but it's how he portrays them to the voters he's trying to win over. Do you mind breaking down some of the values based messaging that can actually help decrease some of the polarization that we see nowadays?
So, in my lab, we've done a lot of research on political persuasion that's focused on a technique of political persuasion called moral reframing. And the logic of moral reframing is that you can take a political position or a candidate or a policy and be more persuasive if you find a way to connect that policy or candidate to the most deeply held values of the people that you're targeting for persuasion. And in 2020, we got really interested in the Democratic primary race and what, the different rhetorics that were being exhibited by different kinds of candidates, different policy positions people were taking. And one of the things that became very interesting is it seemed like a race where economically progressive policies were on the forefront, of a lot of candidates' agendas, and we were interested in, well, what would it take for that kind of a candidate to win? Not just win the nomination, but win the general election, because economically progressive candidates tend to, in my evaluation, historic U.S. American historical evaluation, tend to underperform relative to the popularity of their policies. So like a lot of progressive economic policies, especially if you're being really strategic about which ones you chose, are very popular in the American mass public. But then economically progressive candidates have not done that well historically in the US, even just in the Democratic primary setting. A lot of reasons why that would be, including access to campaign finances. But one of them might be that the rhetoric that they use, the sort of value touchstones that economically progressive candidates typically use, are not ones that expand the base of support for their policies. And we had this thought, well, what if economically progressive candidates used different sorts of rhetoric? What if they instead made an effort to use the kinds of values and value-based rhetoric that would most, according to our research, expand their base of support the most? And what would that be? Well, in our analysis, that would be using values that resonate with moderate and even conservative Americans, things like loyalty, patriotism, rhetoric around traditionalism, respect for authority, respect in general, the rhetoric of respect, the rhetoric of like hard work, purity, sanctity. There's a whole sort of moral language that predominates outside of the progressive base, which signals something about what your underlying values are. So what we did was we ran a pretty standard candidate choice experiment of the sort that lots of political research organizations are doing all the time. And what we did was we took a Democratic primary candidate, constructed that candidate to have one of two economic policy platforms, either a very progressive platform or a pretty moderately progressive platform, and then had them either use rhetoric that was rooted in more progressive values of like social justice and equality of outcomes and rectifying harms to vulnerable people and preventing harms to vulnerable people, or we used rhetoric that was more the sort of rhetoric designed to resonate with moderates and conservatives. And what we found was that the most popular candidate in the experiments that we were running was the very progressive candidate, who then used the moderate to conservative kind of value rhetoric around patriotism, loyalty, respect for tradition, and so on. And so, and it was interesting when you looked at that candidate, the candidate, I would say, that wound up matching to that the most would probably be Joe Biden, actually, and maybe secondarily after that, maybe Pete Buttigieg. Another thing that was kind of interesting, and then Biden won, and I would argue Buttigieg sort of outperformed expectations as much as any candidate. And when you looked at what mattered the most in influencing people's support, we found that how progressive people's policies were didn't matter a lot. It mattered maybe a little bit. In one of our studies, the very progressive candidate does better than the moderately progressive. And we made a pretty big difference in the actual specifics of their policies, even though it may not sound like it. But we didn't find a big difference there. But the rhetoric, the values they used, the identities they tried to connect to, that mattered a lot. It also shifted the base of support, as you'd expect. So when the person spoke in terms of this kind of social justice, protection from harm rhetoric, their support was predominantly, on the left. And then what we found was a great, substantial increase in support among moderates and even conservatives when the person used that, that rhetoric designed to expand the base without a substantial fall off in support on the left. And so the takeaway really was, if you were trying to maximize support, if that was all you were trying to do is just win the election, you'd combine the value touchstones and the identity touchstones of this kind of rhetoric with actually pretty progressive policies. And we try to think about like people that sound like that beyond the candidates of like Biden, Buttigieg in the last race. I think it reminded me of Woody Guthrie a little bit, of like this kind of soaring, unifying, patriotic messaging. But then the thing you're messaging about is a really progressive view of America. and that treats people with, respect, and, is designed to increase equality and redistribute resources in a fairer way. So everybody kind of gets what they want in a way. You get you're sort of giving that identity and values based rhetoric to people who value that most, perhaps, and then you're giving these very popular policies, as well.
It sounds so simple when you explain it because it's essentially just being very human and very authentic and compassionate in how you portray information. And so it seems like counterintuitive. It's like, well, duh, like shouldn't everyone be doing that? But I don't know. I guess to your point, the way that we talk about things is not always very human, and you can't really tangibly feel it like that way. So that's interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah. It isn't intuitive somehow in the contemporary context, even though I agree with you that it seems intuitive to me. I mean, growing up, I grew up like a progressive in red state settings, and so like my family, we were like these secret progressives in these red state settings, and in Kansas and South Carolina, especially in South Carolina, and and so it was very natural to me when I started doing political persuasion research to think about, like, well, somebody who doesn't agree with me on these progressive positions that I'm interested in studying, like, well, how could they come to agree with me more while still being who they are, recognizing that they're coming from real far away in terms of their identity and value commitments from, the natural progressive base that I've been exposed to, because it's real different. And if you've lived in both settings, like you see like, oh wow, like the deep value and identity commitments of these groups of Americans are really different. Even though they share a lot of self-interest, they could support some of the same policies, they could find common ground. They do have overlapping moral commitments for sure, but they also have a lot of moral commitments that are quite different. And so if you can find a way to speak to those and kind of get out of your own sort of moral identity, bubble, to connect to others, it can be more effective. But that's one of the hardest and least intuitive things for people to do. With political persuasion, we tend to approach it. With political persuasion, we tend to approach it in terms of explaining our own reasons for taking the position that we hold, rather than thinking strategically or persuasively about what the person would need to get from where they are to where we're hoping they'll move to. It's like we kind of talk like we're talking to a mirror rather than really having a dialogue. And it's interesting because if you were thinking about like how to sell a car effectively, you wouldn't talk about all of what was in it for you. You wouldn't stay fixated on your perspective. You wouldn't talk about like, Lauren, I'm so excited to get your money because I'm going to spend it on some new DVDs, and you're learning what I'm about. I'm going to get, a new streaming service, maybe, I'm going to buy this thing for my kids, like you wouldn't talk about that. I would instead be like, this is a reliable car that I think you'll like. It has these good features. But when we're talking about politics, we just aren't in that frame of mind. We're in our own perspective, and we're explaining it rather than thinking about like, well, what's in it for this person that's different from me, who isn't me, and has a different set of interests and values and has a different background. How could they agree with me potentially for different reasons?
Yeah, it reminds me. It's funny. I was thinking about the same analogy about selling as well, because I was thinking about even like advertising, like big advertising, and how they make sure to communicate things in a way that you would love, so that you buy their product, right? And
Hmm.
in another conversation, we were speaking with Rui Teixeira and Patrick Ruffini, and kind of just talking about how Democrats have gotten much more into, transactional relationship with voters, which, to your
Mm.
point, even then, they're not necessarily always articulating in a way, like you said, of framing it as what people want to hear and how they want to hear it, and on a values driven message that allows people to feel more involved in it, versus like you said, like a car salesman that's just like, you need to buy this car because it's good for you, kind of thing. And that's not fair, because that's not how people think. And if you, again, were selling someone a car, you'd be a crappy salesman and people wouldn't want to come to you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I like that Teixeira there is maybe highlighting how, well, don't go too far down the salesman route either. Don't just try to buy someone's vote, because people like, they want to go to the ballot box to be a good person. Like not a lot of people go to the ballot box just to vote for their, bottom line in their personal wallet. They're worried about their family's well-being, their community's well-being. They worry about values. They worry about a vision for their state or community or country. So they do want to go be a good person when they vote, and they are thinking about what we call sociotropic concerns, so like society-wide, community-wide, not just personal ones. So yeah, when you're thinking about like, I need to connect to this person and what they value, you know definitely being sure that you're listening to them and attending to them and being like, well, what does this person value? Okay, well, they're religious. They have an acute sense of loyalty to their family. They have a deep sense that their community is valuable, but that value is underrated outside the community. Really figure out like, what does the person or set of people I'm trying to connect to, what do they care about? And then see, is there some way that we can go from, from this policy or candidate to where that person's at or that set of people is at, while honoring who they are, because otherwise you're expecting them to just change who they are, and people don't like that.
Right, which is also very unrealistic. Even when you're when you're dating someone, it's like you don't just expect someone to change. Like it's like you gotta love that person how they are and stuff. Um,
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
that. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit here, and we've talked before about this, so hopefully it's not too out of left field. But we talked a
yeah.
little bit about you called it like the contrast between the beginning of persuasion versus the recipe for a fight or an argument.
Hmm.
Do you want to maybe expand upon what that means and some examples of that?
The way I think about this is something like the following. The United States has this really challenging situation where you have to be good at persuasion to be effective at all politically. And that's because of a combination of two features of the United States. So one is that the United States is one of the most diverse countries in the world, like incredibly diverse. So very high levels of ethnic diversity. The US was already famous in like comparative political studies for having a very ethnically diverse working class that was easy to divide and hard to organize. And it's only gotten, more ethnically diverse, like substantially more, since people were writing about that 50 years ago. There's a lot of class diversity in the US that comes from our extraordinary levels of economic inequality for a developed Western democracy. And then we also have huge amount of regional diversity because, of how big the country is. So we just super unusually diverse country. And then you take that and mush it together with our first past the post electoral system, which which splits us into two parties. And in those two parties are required to get to 50% plus one to win elections. So you really have to build majorities. And then you have the checks and balances at the state and federal levels. And that means you really have to get to super majorities of support on issues and candidates to, and parties to get much done, because you need to have pretty strong majorities. And especially if people refuse to get rid of the Senate filibuster. But that's another issue. So in any event, not that we've had that many opportunities to do so. So you have to get these large amounts of people on board with something despite their underlying diversity. And what that requires is the acknowledgement that people are going to need to agree on things for different reasons. But that's an inherently difficult thing to do politically. Like movements don't tend to work like that. Like movements don't tend to have, there are like multivocal, multi-constituency social movements, but they tend to be still seen internally as two movements working on a thing together while still being two separate things. Like, it is very hard to get these like multi-constituency political movements and parties to work together and reach that kind of critical mass necessary to affect change. So one thing that would be very helpful would be for this to be more understood, I think, and for it to be more understood that pragmatically, for the left, for example, to achieve change, it's, through government at least, we're going to need to be okay with agreeing on things for different reasons, and we're not going to be able to be exacting in our expectations that somebody not just have this view, but they have it for this reason, and then they also have these other six views, that we're going to accept agreement where we have it, and and just accept that. But that's hard, because social movements tend to mobilize around a shared moral vision like that. That's like the fuel that fires a lot of political engagement. and it's different from accepting diversity and difference in a constituency. So that I don't want to be like naive about this or disrespectful that movements don't discover this pluralism naturally, because it's like kind of unnatural to the natural fire that a movement runs on. So it just is hard. But that's why we have to like just invent something that's not been invented before, like a powerful, vision for a progressive movement or a left movement that involves a tolerance for difference, but highlights and appreciates and emphasizes the overlap.
We just, building a little nuance and goes a long way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's funny because actually my next question for you was in the vein of pragmatists versus utopians, and we talked about this before as well. And perhaps maybe how do those views of being pragmatic versus being utopian contribute to the polarization that we're seeing now, given what you just mentioned about nuance?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is a distinction I go back to a lot. A lot of people think about like progressives versus moderate Democrats, or there's similar within party disagreements on the right, between like MAGA, Trump supporting Republicans, and then center right, moderate Republicans. The thing that I keep going back to, because I'm among other things a political psychologist, is that there's an underlying different psychological orientation to the center left and progressives, which is around, as I read it, pragmatism and idealism or utopianism. And so if you're morally motivated, your pathway in, you're like very morally motivated, and your pathway into politics has been a social movement path, like a movement path, and you might say outside strategy kind of path, you're more likely to be idealistic, utopian, not be oriented towards sacrificing some of what you want to get a higher probability of the outcome, and maybe not very patient with the, what you're hearing about the difficulties of achieving the more idealistic policy agenda you want. You want it, that's what you're in it for. You have a moral investment in the ideal outcome, like you want, healthcare for all, you want true racial justice, like you want true gender egalitarianism for everybody of any gender, and that is in contrast with another style of politics that's more, you might say, pragmatic. It's more oriented towards what are the details of implementation that must be attended to, what are the institutional barriers and challenges, what are the what do we need to do to implement something. And that pragmatic orientation tends to be a little bit more oriented towards the probability of getting something done, independent of the magnitude of the outcome. This is how I think about it. Now, these are two groups of folks that end up having to work together a lot. I'm most familiar with this in the sort of Democratic Party space or the left space of like where the pragmatists have to find a way to work together with the movement folks because they're both motivated enough to be there. The pragmatists are often these like policy experts, insiders. They're thinking about inside strategy stuff of like, I have to do this thing that I don't love, this kind of compromise, that I don't want to do here to achieve this other outcome, and maybe I have to do some kind of horse trading that I don't really want to do, but I'm going to do it because it's going to get something done. It's going to be a net benefit. And then the idealists are like, why are you doing, why are you selling the farm to get, mediocre incremental change? Like we're here, for something bigger than that. And these two groups have a lot of trouble cooperating for like really, really obvious reasons. They end up having to make these, they end up being put at loggerheads a lot, especially in the U.S. system, again, where you have to navigate all these checks and balances, and it's really, really difficult. And at the federal level, there's like one or two pieces of really exciting legislation from the left going through a decade or something, so it's like really, really hard to get things done. And these groups they struggle to appreciate one another and work together. And I'm sometimes, like I really relate to both sides, because I think it makes a lot of sense to be there for the principles, to try to just do the right thing, to want the best thing from your government and the best thing for the people of the country. And then it also makes sense to be savvy to the institutional constraints that are going to shape what you actually can achieve. And in the best of all worlds, they actually can support each other. The pragmatists help implement the vision of the idealists. The idealists keep the pragmatists from compromising too much and losing track of what it's all about and what it's all in service of. The idealists sometimes produce like a disruptive, structure challenging force with which the pragmatists can leverage to achieve change, like, hey, are you tired of these protests happening in this setting? We'll vote for this bill and they'll go away or at least be diminished. Sometimes they can work productively in that kind of way. But I think more often in the recent past in the US, they really struggle to work together productively.
Which makes a lot more sense now that you explained it that way as well, because I feel like you said, you need a balance of the two. You don't necessarily need one or the other. You need a balance because in the same manner that pragmatists want to work together, sometimes people are willing to compromise on things that perhaps should not be compromised on. And obviously, who decides what those compromising elements are or not, or is questionable. But I do think that that's a good point about having the ideals of something and not being willing to fall short of them in some manners.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's one thing. I think it's really easy to lose track of. So if you're an idealist, often you are an idealist in part because you haven't been you weren't like a poli sci major at like at a university, and so you just don't know all that stuff. Like and the knowledge of what it takes to get somebody elected or to pass a piece of legislation or what have you, achieve like an institutional political goal. I mean, access to that is really unequally distributed across society, where there's a lot of people who maybe most need something more from their government who don't have access to that information or are disadvantaged in terms of access to it. And it's really important to keep that in mind because I think sometimes the pragmatist side can get a little bit elitist. I mean, they maybe don't want to be elitist, but it can sound kind of haughty, like, oh, these movement folks are being unreasonable and they're just not attending closely to like what's actually possible, or they're unifying around a message that simply doesn't make sense and is turning off voters. Like, okay, but just remember, like, that knowledge you have from going to Georgetown and majoring in political science is like not something most people have access to. And they're trying to get their voice heard. They're trying to be involved in politics. And frankly, you need their votes to win anyway. So you need to have some respect for where they're coming from. And of course, vice versa as well. Like the idealists, they do need the pragmatists to get the stuff done. And they do have to take their foot off the gas sometimes to like, to work within the very difficult structures of American politics. And that may involve trusting somebody who says they know more about you about something. And that may seem wrong. And be very careful who you put your trust in when you sacrifice some of what you want, to get something done. But it is probably a necessary calculus for an idealist.
Yeah, and even in that vein as well, again, I think when we talked before, we talked about how you may have come across some research on moderates being perceived as morally unmotivated or uncaring or not knowledgeable or unethical or whatever. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, this is some fascinating new research by Rachel Rattan and Katie DeCellis at University of Toronto, social psychologists. And they're studying something that will be immediately intuitive, I think, to most listeners, which is that people who are associated with moderate positions on political issues are seen as less moral, less morally motivated, and even seen for, divisive and morally charged issues as really like morally questionable. Like, how the hell can you be moderate on this issue, like abortion? Like, how can you be moderate on abortion policy? Like, you must go one way or another. There's not really a reason to be in the middle. And can even sometimes people will trust someone in the middle less than someone that's further away from them because they're like, well, geez, at least the person on the other side is bringing some morality to this like obviously morally charged issue. This moderate is like super questionable. And I think here we have the pragmatist dilemma, right? Like a pragmatist might take a moderate position on a policy or support a candidate that looks moderate because of a calculus of how to take more ambitious values and more ambitious political goals and squeeze them through the pluralistic society and polity that we have to deal with to get people elected, and also through the very difficult, heavily polarized legislatures we have to get things through, and so on. So some of those people that look like moderates are really pragmatists with ambitious goals, deep value-based, motivations, maybe just as morally motivated as the more idealistic, movement-oriented, sort of outside strategy folks. And you just can't tell the difference necessarily. So you see somebody on social media where you really can't tell the difference, suggesting some moderate course of action for a party, and you can't tell, like, is this person just not getting it? Like, do they not bring enough morality to this? Like, do they not understand this really matters and we should want big changes? Or, are they a pragmatist who's supporting a path that they think can actually, will actually put points on the board, that's more likely to achieve some sort of change in the near term? And because of that, that's a difficulty, because then that means that, especially in our sort of flattened social media discourse, people end up getting, I think, pilloried for advocating for pragmatist positions, even though they have really strong moral motivations and they're just doing it for strategic reasons. They get pilloried for just not caring enough and for being potentially, like moral enemies of the base. When I think they maybe aren't, and you may be able to think of like immediate examples that pop into mind of folks who've run afoul of the majority of progressives, even though they probably really line up with progressives and are making a different pragmatic calculus on the specifics of implementation. And it would be helpful. I know I keep talking about these like cultural ideas or projects that we should make happen. But here's another one that I think would be great. It'd be great if we had an understanding of that when you see somebody advocating for what might read as a less morally motivated, more moderate path, they might care as much about the issue as you and just be advocating for it for pragmatic, strategic reasons, rather than lack of gumption and conviction and investment. Yeah, if we had a better understanding of that, meet each other with a little more grace in these difficult, flattened, coarsened settings like social media, then it'd be easier to build and sustain coalitions.
I absolutely love this because I feel like, well, one, we need to put that on a freaking poster and a bumper sticker. Because, no, to your point, though, Senator Joe Manchin and even, sometimes the votes that our friends, the Blue Dog co-chairs take, the Democratic base is like, well, how could you support them? How can they remain part of the Democratic Party? They should be independents or whatever. And it's like what you just pointed out is just so important, because it's not that they're not, very values based or very in tune on what's going on. It's that they are taking the pragmatic route. And on top of that, they have to get reelected in districts or even states that are incredibly hard for a Democrat to get elected in. So to your point, I just, chef's kiss on that. That is perfectly said.
I remember I went to DC a little bit before the pandemic, it was like 2019, and I was really interested in the Blue Dog Democrats and then the Congressional Progressive Caucus and how they were getting along or not getting along, and was going around interviewing people, talking to small groups of, staffers and aides and so on. And one of the central points of conflict at that time was Medicare for All, where there was this Medicare for All legislation the Congressional Progressive Caucus had put together and was really trying to whip up votes for and getting a bunch of votes for. And I would talk to the Congressional Progressive Caucus folks, and they'd be like, look, we're out of power. We don't have the presidency, but we're trying to take a philosophy here that we think is the right philosophy of like, what if people just showed up in DC and did the right thing? Like, crazy idea. Like, and if you could get everybody to do that, we'd be in a better place. And we should all be able to agree everybody deserves healthcare. And I'd walk out of that meeting and I'd be like, man, that makes a lot of sense. That's a great vision, like that makes tons of sense. It's a movement logic you really, it's hard to debate with. And I walk into a meeting with Blue Dog staffers who are like, these Congressional Progressive Caucus folks are trying to get my, my congressperson that I work for to vote on Medicare for All and to vote for it. And, he's in a purple district, and if he votes for it, that's going to wind up being in the ads that he's going to have to run against. And it's going to lower his chances of getting reelected, which makes it harder in the next term, in 2021 to get things done, because you'll 1 or 10 less congressional seats in the House because people ran against, use the Medicare for all votes to run against these moderate Democrats in purple districts. And you might not be able to get Medicare for all in 2021, but you might be able to make some kind of forward progress on that and other issues if you don't do this now. And it's not like we can even pass this. The president's going to veto it. It's not going to pass the Senate. So it's not even for anything. I'd walk out of that meeting and be like, oh, wow, like they're really right, and at the end of the day, like one of those logics, I think makes much more sense to me. I don't know, I say that, but I guess I tend to think that the blue dog logic made more sense in that case. But I totally get the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Like there is a clear moral argument there that makes a lot of sense. And making progress on healthcare is arguably, you could say should be the number one priority for the federal government. And you can see where it's difficult. So more understanding, more appreciation, more working together in locked rooms, yammering this out, and appreciation that people are approaching things with really good intentions in both of these factions, and have a lot of common ground. I just need to find a way to work together strategically better.
Yeah, and I know we're coming up on time here, so I want to be mindful of that. And I'm going to leave you with 2 more questions. And I just am super grateful for this conversation, Robb. This has been so good, and I could do another 30 minutes, but I'm going to keep it short. So last 2 questions for you. One, I don't want to gloss over the work that y'all do at your lab. And so if there's anything that you're working on that you think people should know about, even just in the context of this election cycle, of just understanding, like I think sometimes it's really nice for people to be like, okay, thank God someone's working on this, right? Like, it doesn't have to be something that's happening right here, right now, but at least somebody's working on this. So I think that maybe could be reassuring for people to know what you guys have been finding and, producing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last question that we ask every guest is, what is one depolarizing activity that listeners can participate in after watching this or listening to this podcast?
Oh, that's great. That's great. So on the first thing, maybe I'll flag 2 pieces of research that come to mind. So one is this research we do on the activist, what we call the activist dilemma, which is this pattern where the sorts of protest activities that get the most media attention. So at the extreme, like violence, but also more moderate, like less extreme tactics like property destruction or, highly disruptive stuff like shutting down highways. These things get lots of media attention, but they tend to turn people off. Like people don't like them. And then the kinds of protest tactics that people like more and are more likely to say, okay, I have nothing wrong with this tactic, and I'm going to listen to what these activists are talking about, are things like, marches, civil disobedience of a not massively disruptive sort, chance, bringing attention through a demonstration to a locus of power that's doing something wrong, and drawing that media attention to that place. These things are less likely to get major headlines. You're going to need more people doing them and a better media strategy, and you have to get really creative. And it's just harder, period, even after you do all that. But they're more persuasive. And so this is sort of the activist dilemma of like, you want headlines, there's a value in that, of course, but you might end up taking a tactical approach that actually leads you to turn the average person off that learns about what you did. And this is like hugely difficult to overcome. And you can see why lots of activists make different kinds of decisions. And I think the stage of mobilization that a movement's at can have a lot to do with how they make a decision around the activist dilemma. So if you're at an early stage, like you're like maybe a radical animal rights group, it might make a lot of sense to be highly disruptive in a way that irritates some folks, but you're getting your whole idea out there. People are like, oh, I didn't even know that like radical definitions of animals, of animal personhood, for example, was even a policy position people had. Like, now I know about it, and then you spend the next decade trying to convince them to agree with you. But if you're at a really advanced stage where policies are on the table and you're trying to move, 6 votes in the House or something like that, the last thing you would want to do is gain more attention. You don't really need it. People are already paying attention. You already got the bill in the House, let's say, and but you're turning people off on average. That's the kind of thing that leads a congressperson to be like, oh, okay, now I can't vote for this because it's toxic, and I actually lose votes now voting for it rather than not voting for it. So that's one thing that we've studied, and a lot of the stuff we do, I'm really oriented towards how can we appreciate the perspectives of decision makers in our political system. And so here it's like, let's take seriously the challenging situation activists find themselves in, because what they'd really like is to be persuasive and impactful. Like everybody knows what they're saying and they say it persuasively. And that's inherently hard. That's real hard. And how can we do work that appreciates that and then tries to chart a strategic path through that so activists can be effective? So that's one thing. I'm sorry, I kind of went on there. But then another line of work that I did want to highlight is actually in a case where we maybe are showing that there isn't a dilemma that everybody thinks is there. And that's some work on the Disagree Better public service announcement campaign that has been spearheaded by Republican Governor Spencer Cox from Utah in his leadership of the National Governors Association. He got pairs of governors, Democrats and Republicans, to film a series of public service announcements endorsing Democrats and Republicans being open to bipartisan cooperation and bipartisan civility and being able to disagree about important issues, but disagree, in the same room, talking it through. And I found these to be really compelling public service announcements that seem to role model for me the kinds of conversations we need to have in the US across left-right lines, but also across factional lines within the left and perhaps within the right as well. Like people need to be able to talk this stuff out respectfully and tolerate disagreement and get through it. And what we found was when we showed Americans of various stripes the different Disagree Better public service announcements, they found them persuasive. They tended to be, more open to bipartisan conversation, more open to bipartisan cooperation, less disliking of all folks on the other side. But then they also liked the people in the ads more, Democrats and Republicans. And we found this even amongst strong partisans, which was not something that I expected. I didn't expect that strong Democrats and strong Republicans, when they saw a governor get up there with a governor from the other side and say, hey, we should pursue bipartisan respect, that there'd be this substantial increase in favorable views of that kind of bridging position. It's totally inconsistent with our stereotypes of what strong partisans want. And that suggested to me some reason for optimism that maybe we could actually have, if people were presented with a different way, they might be like, oh yeah, now that I see it, I like that better, So that made me optimistic, and also optimistic that we could get more politicians to take up that strategy if they thought it was good for them.
We love humanity, right?
Yeah,
Simple act of humanity. And I'm sorry,
Yeah.
one last thing, just the one depolarizing activity that listeners can participate in. It could be reading something, watching something, listening to something, et cetera, anything that you're thinking that people, and also could just be, go outside and read a book. I don't know, whatever you're thinking.
I would say the number one thing that comes to mind for me is to get involved in a campaign, maybe a local or state level campaign, and potentially also, or even a federal level campaign, whatever. And then the best version of that engagement would be to do like canvassing, like to do like actual talking with people that disagree with you, with some training on how to do it well, because I think that it's not easy to do it well. I was once a really mediocre canvasser, and I can say training helps. But I think that see, in some ways, I'm tempted to say, oh, join a partisan bridging organization, and that's good. That would be wonderful. But I actually think you can get a lot of what you need from just getting into the machinery of politics and getting exposure to like, oh, this is how they do it. I appreciate it. I don't like this thing, but I do appreciate these 6 things. And then I'm having these conversations. People disagree with me. These kinds of conversations are actually pretty doable. These are insanely hard, and you just get a better appreciation of like how the change is made and how hard it is. But also you get some small victories, and that feels good too. So that's where it's happening, it's in the apparatus of these social change machines of campaigns and such. And so plugging in is, I found very educational.
Yeah, your colleague Dee Dee had a great line about, be a partisan and then be part of the like essentially the change that you want to see in your own party. And I think that's a great point that
Uh,
you're just saying there. Like, be part of something and then learn about the other side, but also be willing to, be invested in the party that you've chosen. And that could be all the difference.
I'm not surprised that Dee Dee would have such wisdom for us.
I look,
That's on brand.
we
Yeah.
love Dee Dee. We love Dee Dee. So,
Yeah.
Robb, this was so excellent. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation and just appreciate your time so much.
Yeah, me too, Lauren, and great to be connecting with a fellow South Carolinian.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely,
truly.
absolutely. Thanks so much, Robb. Take care.
You too.